So I've suggested that a basic figure throughout Keats's poetry is an infinitely elusive object of desire. Um, that Keats turns his frustration into, or dissatisfaction into kind of art form, an elaborate means of self-representation unto itself. This is related to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the slave discourse of making one's own wound expressive. So it's interesting to notice this kind of archetype of the elusive woman, the her male worshiper is takes relishes his own frustration, and there's a famous book of philosophy about Venus in Furs by the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze called Coldness and Cruelty. And Deleuze argues that there's something emancipating in the way in which masochism anticipates its own punishment and makes it expressive. I love the French title, Le Froid et le Cruel. Deleuze describes the attitude elaborated by Massach in Venus in Furs as a way of desexualizing love while at the same time sexualizing the entire history of humanity. I think that's really applies to Keats. Think about the cold pastoral of the Grecian urn that becomes a friend to man. The impenetrability, unknowability, the sort of sublime mystery, uncertainty, and doubt of human suffering, human experience, human passion becomes an occasion of love in the most expansive sense. Saint Agnes is another consummate orphan figure, the patron saint of virgins, and whom Keats makes into, I think, sort of a patron saint of queer sexuality, or an orphaned sexuality, an orphaned desire. Marginalized by history. The Eve of St. Agnes refers to kind of a folk legend according to which maidens, virgins, will, if they perform a certain ritual on this night, receive visions of their future husbands. As we've already seen, I think, in Keats, this fugitive worship, like the worshiping Psyche that is worshipped by no one else, illegitimate, marginal devotion. This story it's so wonderful. It's the longest poem by far that you'll be reading by Keats. But it's so wonderful to have this long narrative to go through. And I just invite you, as I was just saying, to sort of think about the interplay of cold and hot, legitimate and illegitimate. Again, we get a narrative mostly from the male perspective. It seems like a perspective of conquest, but there again is a kind of female collective. Madeline, the love interest of Prothero, is depicted here. Angela, who assists Madeline in constructing her ritual, and St. Agnes herself. We see these female devotees of a fantasy contrasted with the narrative of conquest. And, you know, not to mention the beadsmen. These are all outsider figures of a kind of queer desire, devotion to desire without claims of conquest. This is kind of interpenetration of the beadsman's devotion, Angela's devotion, Madeline's devotion, and St. Agnes seems to be suggested by this poem. Notice, for instance, how the beadsman rejects the music of the ball, just like Madeline will do. She's uninterested in the official celebration, has no interest in her suitors at the ball. She's devoted instead to the dream of Saint Agnes. And listen also to what it says here about the beadsman. His prayer he saith, this patient holy man, then takes his lamp and rises from his knees, and back returneth, meager, barefoot, wan. Along the chapel aisle by slow degrees, the sculptured dead on each side seem to freeze, imprisoned in black purgatorial rails, knights, ladies, praying in dumb oratories. He passeth by, and his weak spirit fails to think how they may ache in icy hoods and mails. Just like in the Ode on a Grecian Urn, he's empathizing with these stone statues that are freezing. He imagines them freezing in the cold. And look here how he is aligned with Madeline in his rejection of the official revelry. At length burst in the argent revelry, with plume, tiara, and all rich array, numerous as shadows haunting fairly the brain, new stuffed in youth with triumphs gay of old romance. These let us wish away, and turn, soul-thoughted, to one lady there, whose heart had brooded all that wintry day on love, and winged Saint Agnes' saintly care, and as she heard old dames full many times declare, they told her how on Saint Agnes' eve young virgins might have visions of delight, soft adorings from their loves receive upon the honeyed middle of the night, if ceremonies due they did aright, as supperless to bed they must retire, and couch supine their beauties lily white, nor look behind nor sideways, but require of heaven with upward eyes for all that they desire. I mentioned that Byron ridiculed Keats's poetry as masturbatory, and I might suggest that he wasn't wrong to characterize it in this way. I mean, this is a personal dream, a personal fantasy that Madeline prefers over actual romance. She heeded not at all. In vain came many a tiptoe amorous cavalier, and back retired, not cooled by high disdain, but she saw not, her heart was otherwhere. She sighed for Agnes' dreams, the sweetest of the year. She danced along with vague, regardless eyes, anxious her lips, her breathing quick and short. The hallowed hour was near at hand. She sighs amid the timbrels and the thronged resort of whisperers in anger or in sport. Mid looks of love, defiance, hate, and scorn, hoodwinked with fairy fancy, all amort, save to Saint Agnes and her lambs unshorn, and all the bliss to be before tomorrow morn. On the one hand, she's hoodwinked with fairy fancy, Madeline is. She's tricked. She's deceived by this fantasy, and the fantasy is all she wants. She doesn't want to learn who her husband is. She's wants the fantasy for its own sake, all the bliss before tomorrow morn. She's not dreaming of her fantasy of actual marriage. She's just looking forward to her dream itself, which Keats underscores. It's illegitimate, just like his characterization of Chapman's Homer. It's illegitimate, secondhand translation. Even that, looking into Chapman's Homer, has a kind of, if not masturbatory, it has a promiscuous, rogue enjoyment of the book, exploiting the book. Like, it's not even to say looking into Chapman's Homer, that's a undisciplined kind of attention. It's not even that he's not reading the original Greek. He's not even properly reading it all. He's looking into the book. That looking into suggests a kind of enjoyment of the physical book, which I kind of relate to, just the pleasure of, holding a book, even a kind of fetishizing of the book. So that also, I think, suggests the pleasure that he's talking about is a self-determining fantasy, a fantasy and a desire that are not wedded to or dependent upon conquest, but enjoy fantasy and desire for their own sake, just like Madeline. In the Eve of St. Agnes, Keats tells the story of how Prothero hijacks Madeline's dream in a way. He hears that she's paying this ritual obedience to St. Agnes for the sake of all the bliss to be before tomorrow morn. And he connives to invade her fantasy, invade her dream, as if he were the vision. And a question we're left with by the end of the story is whether, it seems as if he succeeds in tricking her and makes his conquest and runs off with her. But I'd like you to read it carefully, and like in other poems we've been looking at, La Belle Dame sans Merci in particular, I think it leaves open the possibility that Madeline's dream supplants Prothero's narrative of conquest. When it seems as if Prothero's narrating his conquest of Madeline, maybe instead we're getting Madeline's dream. In any event, I think that ambiguity that we're left with, the image of phantoms gliding from the castle, like phantoms they glide. It's a phrase that's repeated. It's as if we're in dreamland rather than in the world of the narrative reality. One indication of this, I think, is that Prothero sings La Belle Dame sans Merci to Madeline as a means of invading her dream, of seducing her, which suggests maybe Prothero doesn't understand the poem. After all, that's a poem of male self-deception, delusion of conquest. Another indication is love, my Madeline, sweet dreamer. He's falling in love with the dreamer. She's still in her dream. And most powerfully for me is this image of the dove forlorn and lost with sick unpruned wing. This is another image we see in Keats, of the sick bird unable to fly, orphaned from its proper home in the sky. On Seeing the Elgin Marbles is another version of Keats's ode on a Grecian urn in the form of a sonnet. And he uses the image here of a sick bird looking at the sky. It's an image of queer desire, the pleasure of imagining a home rather than claiming it with a, proprietary claim to conquest. Listen how he describes the infinite distance, the coldness of the marbles that remind him of his own mortality, the eternity evoked here makes him feel all the more his own mortality, vulnerability, subjection to desire. But this encounter with coldness Keats makes it into a medium of luxury, of luxuriating in his own self, in his own experience of time, his own experience of desire. My spirit is too weak. Mortality weighs heavily on me like unwilling sleep, and each imagined pinnacle and steep of godlike hardship tells me I must die like a sick eagle looking at the sky. Yet 'tis a gentle luxury to weep, that I have not the cloudy winds to keep fresh for the opening of the morning's eye. Such dim conceived glories of the brain bring round the heart an undescribable feud. So do these wonders a most dizzy pain that mingles Grecian grandeur with the rude wasting of old time, with the billowy main, a sun, a shadow of a magnitude. As I've discussed before, grammar becomes a key, plays a key role in this poem. In particular, the switch, I think, from the predominant determinate article, the, switches to the indeterminate article, a, especially the image of a sun, as if one among many, not the sun. It's as if the sick bird imagines and thereby realizes its own son. I think this is Deleuze meant by eroticizing all of history, creating one's own universe, own object of desire, own world of purpose and direction. This theme and project of eroticizing history, or reclaiming a kind of free, imaginative, passionate, creative relationship to history, to our story, to the story, our narrative. Goes back, of course, to Blake, reclaiming this mental fight to sustain an imaginative passion, mythic relationship to the real world, to the story and perception of reality around. In the sunflower, even death, where the traveler's journey is done, Blake eroticizes here. The imagination, like all these romantics insist in one way or another, is predicated on pleasure. To imagine is to appropriate for the sake of creativity and enjoyment. Even when we're thinking about death, it becomes another story of arising, aspiring, wishing. I think this passage of Nietzsche's from The Gay Science about history, reclaiming history for a new experience of the divine. He, similarly to Keats, emphasizes the figure of the orphan, that restoring divinity to history, a kind of divine mythic purpose, is a matter of empathizing, reimagining and empathizing with history's losers, everyone that's left out of history. So in this passage that's extremely moving and beautiful, I think he describes what such a history would be like. He who knows how to regard the history of man in its entirety as his own history feels in the immense generalization all the grief of the invalid who thinks of health, of the old man who thinks of the dream of his youth, of the lover who is robbed of his beloved, of the martyr whose ideal is destroyed, of the hero on the evening of the indecisive battle which has brought him wounds and the loss of a friend. But to bear this immense sum of grief of all kinds, to be able to bear it, and yet still be the hero who, at the commencement of a second day of battle, greets the dawn and his happiness, as one who has horizons of centuries before and behind him, as the heir of all nobility, of all past intellect, and the obligatory heir of all the old nobles, while at the same time the first of a new nobility, the equal of which has never been seen or even dreamt of. To take all this upon his soul, the oldest, the newest, the losses, hopes, conquests, and victories of mankind, to have all this at last in one soul, and to comprise it in one feeling, this would necessarily furnish a happiness which man has hitherto not known, a God's happiness, full of power and love, full of tears and laughter, a happiness which, like the sun in the evening, continuously gives of its inexhaustible riches and empties into the sea, and like the sun too, feels itself richest when even the poorest fisherman rows with golden oars. This divine feeling might then be called humanity. Notice the analogous image here of the sun. It's like in the sunflower. The sun becomes enriched by being reflected in the oars of the poorest fisherman. The most meager purpose, the most meager desire enriches even the sun, creates a new sun. This power of fantasy, of desire for its own sake, negative capabilities stretching the longest distance from the most extreme human marginalization to the grandest fantasy of fulfillment.